Okay, great. So I'm just going to say welcome. Wonderful to see everybody tonight. My name is Eileen Corcoran, and I'm the Community Outreach Manager for the Vermont Historical Society. And we're excited to have you here tonight for our talk. This talk is part of our programming for our League of Local Historical Societies and Museums, which is our informal network of the over 190 historical societies and museums across Vermont. And so we do a variety of programming throughout the year. This talk had been originally scheduled for our conference last year, but we're excited to be able to bring it to you virtually now when it is still winter, apparently. So coming up, if you're interested in more local history programming, we do have another one of our virtual roundtables on March 17th, which is going to feature another wonderful Rokeby Museum employee, Tucker Foltz, as well as Amanda Gustin from VHS, who are going to be talking about new ideas for programming. And of course, you can check out everything that we are doing at our website, vermonthistory.org. A couple other quick technical notes. Definitely, we appreciate that everybody who's not actively speaking is muted. That just helps to get rid of any interference. We're going to plan to take questions basically when speakers are done. So if you do have any questions, you can hold them till then. You can feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and we'll monitor those and sort of put them out. And that's also a great place for comments. If you do want to make a comment or a question as appropriate during times when those are available, please use the raise your hand function. We're going to have a fair number of people on the screen, so we can't see everybody at any one time. So using your raise hand feature is a great way to make sure we notice who has a question. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Lindsay Houpt-Varner, who is the Executive Director of the Rokeby Museum in Ferrisburg. Lindsay.
Thank you very much. Get my PowerPoint started again. So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much, Eileen, for giving us the opportunity to speak since we couldn't make it to the conference to give this presentation. I'm going to kick it off tonight kind of talking a little bit about my own experiences and a little bit more broadly about this idea of whose history is preserved within institutions, archives, historical societies, historic sites generally across the country. And tell you a little bit about the experience that I've had in my career within public history. So I started my career as a historian of community culture, and I just kind of fell into public history over the course of my graduate program, my master's and my PhD. And I ended up coming back to the United States. I did my degrees abroad, and I started working for a program called Community Heart and Soul, which was developed by the Orton Family Foundation right here in Vermont. And I was working in a town in Pennsylvania that unrolled the Heart and Soul model. And this program really became my aha moment for how communities have gone about preserving archival histories in the past, and how we have really been thinking about the items that are worthy of preserving and the histories that are preserved, and what this does for us today when we start to look at how we interpret our exhibits and our spaces and the histories within our communities. So I'm going to start with talking about not a site in Vermont, a site in Pennsylvania that really became the catalyst for changing the way I view how we've been preserving history, that has really influenced the work that I've done going forward. In 2016, I started working with Community Heart and Soul in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I was situated in a county historical society. And one of my projects was to actually go out into the communities and ask them what they would hate to lose in their community, or things that they would like to ensure were preserved within their community. And I sat down with a family, the Gumby family, in particular, Harriet Gumby, who was in her 80s at the time. And I'm sitting in her living room, and we talked for a couple of hours, and all through the conversation, she kept talking about her grandfather, Elias Parker, who was a Civil War veteran. He had been enslaved in Maryland. And after the Civil War had settled in Mount Holly Springs, this little tiny town of about 2,000 people in central Pennsylvania. And she kept talking about the church. And I asked her eventually, what church do you mean? I grew up in this area. I know Mount Holly. I had never heard of Mount Tabor AME Zion Church. And she said, oh, the church behind my house. So the picture that you see on your left with all of the trees is me standing in the middle of her yard behind her house. And that is the view that you could see of the church. And when you walk around to the front, you would see the door and the entranceway into the building. And this church is probably 1878-ish. It was when it was established. The congregation was established a little before that, closer to 1870. And Harriet told me over and over again within our conversation that, if the question I kept asking her is, what would you like to see preserved for the future? What would you hate to lose? And she said the African-American history in this town. And when I was talking with her, I realized that growing up in this area, I had never learned about an African-American community, a church, or even the cemetery that existed close by. It was not in my education. And when I went back to the County Historical Society to do research, I realized it didn't exist in the archives. It didn't exist in the Historical Society. There were maybe mentions here or there, but the church and the African-American community as a whole was basically non-existent in the historical record, even though this building is proof that they did exist. And we very quickly at the Historical Society brought together researchers and preservation experts and historians to start to explore this site a little bit more. And what we came to realize is within the church as a whole, we were looking at a time capsule of history, not just within the building itself. And this is the interior when I first walked over and looked in the window after I had talked with Harriet. The building itself was this incredible historical artifact. But the community was still around. The congregation lasted until the 1970s, and there were still congregants living in the area who had stories and had memories that had never been collected and had not been shared. So we started to bring all of these people together to start having a conversation about, one, what to do with the church. You can see from the photos, it is a condemnable building. It still is, although they're about to break ground and restore it today. But we started talking about the structure, but then also talking about the history, and that we needed to start recording this history as soon as possible before those stories were lost. So we have this building filled with stuff. We have a church that was probably saved because of the trees that were surrounding it. And the big vines that you see growing in are all poison ivy vines that pretty much held the walls up. This church was saved because the community around it protected it, and the vegetation around it really protected it from anybody on the outside coming in and taking everything that was inside. The most documented piece of this history is actually the cemetery. About a minute or two walk down the street from the church is the segregated cemetery for the community. Nobody ever called it the segregated cemetery. It's listed on the maps as the quote unquote colored cemetery of Mount Holly Springs. Some people call it the Mount Tabor Cemetery, but it wasn't connected to the church. It was connected to the African-American community. And we know by going through some documentation that the main town cemetery was not allowing persons of color to be buried there. So this was the cemetery for the African-American community. And we've been able to piece together a lot of the stories through census records and some employment histories, death records, births and marriages. Looking at these photos, there's about a little over a dozen cemetery headstones within this cemetery. But when I was talking with Harriet and she was telling me about the church, she also told me that the cemetery is much larger than the footprint that people see because of the headstones. And that she's seen people playing on the cemetery, and she would really like to see for the future that the cemetery would be recognized as hallowed ground, including in the spaces that don't have headstones. And so what we really did as a community was seek out to try and make Harriet's wishes a reality. And when we started to tell this story and to dig into the stories of the veterans that are buried there, there are 7 veterans of the Civil War. Some of those individuals had been enslaved. Some had been free and from the community and had enlisted. They were all members of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, and they all settled in Mount Holly Springs, either before the war or after the war, and were involved in some fashion with the church. And their histories really helped us to start bring their stories to the community to life. And one story that always really highlights to me the significance of preserving these histories. Genealogy, I think, especially during the pandemic, really took off as a hobby for a lot of people. And with many of the things that happened in this project, we can say that there have been many serendipitous moments. And the very first one I think we had was when Danny Ward Smith, who's pictured in the center here, had called me about 2 weeks before we were having our first public program at the church, asking if I knew where Henry Ward headstone was. And she couldn't find it. She had been to the area. She didn't know where it was. And she really wanted to find his headstone because it's the only it's as far back as she can go in her ancestry. Henry Ward had been enslaved. We think that when he enlisted, he changed his name. And when he settled in Mount Holly, he kept that name change. So for Danny, when she was doing her genealogy, Henry is the last of her ancestral line. She can't go any further. And for her, having the headstone, being able to visit his grave, being able to visit the church that he had worshiped in, was a huge part of her getting to better know her ancestry, her identity. She brought her children and her family to the site to learn more about Henry Ward. And I was floored that when I went back to the County Historical Society, I had nothing on Henry. I couldn't really help Danny further her research. And as a historian, that absolutely killed me. But this place meant so much. And it really helped to become a catalyst to beginning the process of recording as much as we could with very few written records, the history of this site and incorporating it into the history of the town and of the county to create this more inclusive narrative, because it was in many ways intentionally missing. So all of these stories really led to a whole series of community projects, from clearing out the church to preserve the items inside, to beginning the process of marking out the cemetery, which was one of Harriet's wishes, so that people knew where the boundaries were. The church was listed on the County Historical Register. It is now on the National Register of Historic Places. We had students out to do ground penetrating radar. I had mentioned there's just a little over a dozen headstones in the cemetery, but thanks to the ground penetrating radar, we now know that there were 50 to 60 burials in the cemetery. And thanks to the research of some of the incredible volunteers on this project, we know the names of many of those people, and we now know the possible locations of their burials, so we can start to honor their life in this hallowed ground. And the ground penetrating radar also allowed for a fence to be put in, fulfilling Harriet's wish that the cemetery is recognized fully as this hallowed ground space. And volunteers just really started to come forward, recognizing the importance of this site and the fact that it was just missing from the history entirely. People wanted to do what they could to try and bring this site back to life and to incorporate it back into the community, because it was a community space. So I would show up and neighbors would just be on ladders putting tarps on the roof. We had an archaeological dig to help fill in some of the gaps of the history because the written records did not exist. To one of the more interesting parts of my career, helping to relocate vultures that took up a home in the attic. Just anything that the community could really do to help to preserve this space, people were stepping forward to do it.
You could enjoy.
But what the church really led to was this bigger question. And it's something that I think about a lot in all of the research that I do. But when I went back to the County Historical Society, myself and my colleagues asked the question, whose history is it? When you walk into an archive, when you walk into a museum, who is represented in those collections and why? What is missing from the histories and why are things missing from the histories? And it became very important to us to be able to answer the why and to come to terms with the fact that there was intentional prejudice within collecting practices. And that is something that was symptomatic across the country, not just locally, but oftentimes history was preserved through the best of the best, with representations being often of upper class white culture. And you slowly start to see other things trickling in. And my colleague who I worked with at this historical society said a couple of times, and it's a great quote, that archivists and museum curators are often the great destroyers of history, that they are the ones who are determining what gets kept, what doesn't get kept, what do you accession into the collection or not accession into your collection. And it was very poignant when she said that, because I had never thought of an archivist and a curator in that way. But there are repercussions for what you decide to keep and not keep. And that doesn't mean you keep everything, because you can't, there's just not the space. But being able to ask that question of representation is incredibly important for all institutions. And we've seen in the past few years that a lot of places are starting to recognize their collections practices and implications that that has on telling stories. In 2020, the Alabama State Archives issued a statement that essentially said when they were founded, their intent was to preserve the history of the Confederacy. And to date, that means that they do not have a complete representation of the history of the state. And that has implications for interpretation and how stories can be told and how histories can be researched. And the statement really starts to look at how they can start to create a better collection practice that really starts to look at the whole of the communities within the state. I'm sure some of you have seen the news recently. Just a couple of weeks ago, the school teacher who collected African-American history and essentially had her own museum in her home. This is not an uncommon story. I have met several people that within my career who have had collections in their own home, that they became the repository for their community because they didn't feel, or they were explicitly denied giving items to their local historical institution. And they knew they were important and they knew they should be preserved. So they decided to preserve them themselves. And that type of collecting practice, not taking people's items because it wasn't seen as important enough for the collection, leads to a lot of mistrust within institutions. And you have to rebuild that trust so that people even want to give you some of these items. But it's not an uncommon story to find these incredible collections in private homes. There was recently a project dedicated at St. Mary's College called From Absence to Presence, where they completely flipped their interpretation in the history that they were telling about their campus, so that it didn't focus so much on the enslavers that owned the property that the college is on, but incorporating in the enslaved that worked the land that helped to build the college. And they created this incredible building that is actually made up of the names of the known enslaved people from the property. to bring out their voice and to help tell their story, even if the story is just saying their name. And there are projects like this happening all across the country at cultural sites and museums and archives that are really starting to recognize and think a little bit more about what they currently have in the collection, what's missing, why, and how they can start to remedy that in the future. So with all of the work that I had done down in Pennsylvania, it really led me to my role at Rokeby Museum. I came to Vermont and to Rokeby, which if you haven't been, is in Ferrisburg, Vermont, right on Route 7. And the site really drew me in because it is a National Historic Landmark, as being one of the best documented Underground Railroad sites in the country. It was home to 4 generations of the Robinson family. The second generation were radical abolitionists, and they utilized the house as a stop on the Underground Railroad. They were involved in anti-slavery societies, they were abolitionists. But what drew me to this exhibit, Free and Safe, which is the permanent exhibit at the museum, is that it doesn't just tell the story from the abolitionist perspective, but it draws in the stories of the freedom seekers who came to the site. And we don't have the answers or know all of the information about those freedom seekers, Simon and Jesse, who are talked about within the exhibit. And the museum makes that okay. I think sometimes we're afraid to share stories if we don't have all of the answers or all of the information. But this exhibit really does that. It helps to tell a more complete history by drawing in what we can find from the evidence, even though not a whole lot exists about those 2 freedom seekers who came through. So one of the things that I encourage institutions to do is really look at the collections that you have and question whether or not they are representative of the whole. Sitting in people's homes or even within community memory are stories that might not have been preserved, that are waiting to be told to help to tell a more inclusive history. And I really truly believe that it starts within the community. Something like Mount Tabor would never have come forward had it not been for a single community member who stepped forward and shared the history and told the story, and then allowed action to happen in order to ensure that it was preserved. She trusted me and she trusted other community members with that history and with that story. And I often wonder if we hadn't reached out and we hadn't been sitting down and just having this conversation, whether or not the project would have gotten as far as it has, being a National Register property that's about to be completely restored thanks to generous donations. And so I encourage institutions to work with their community, build bridges in underrepresented communities, and find ways to build representation in our histories and the museums and archival collections. It could be structures and spaces that we're looking at now and not necessarily papers, but they all help to frame this complete narrative and can help to create a more proactive approach to preserving history. If we know what we haven't preserved in the past, we can start preserving things today and start taking these actions within our historical institutions. And you never know what's out there in your community. You might end up being incredibly surprised about the history of your community's past. And it could just be sitting in somebody's home or in somebody's memories of their own family's life in the area. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Cyndy.
Great, thank you so much, Lindsay. So yeah, if anybody has any quick questions for Lindsay, again, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll get Cyndy set up for her part of the talk. Okay. Cyndy looks like she might be a little bit frozen, so we're hoping maybe she'll come back in a second. Technology's fun. Oop. See if we can get her unmuted. There we go.
Well, I'm trying to get in the meeting. I'm not even in the meeting right now.
Okay, I think you're back now. Can you hear us, Cyndy?
I can hear you, but I don't have any visuals right now.
Okay.
Open Zoom. I'm trying to open Zoom.
Okay.
So far, it's not really working too well. I'm
Aw.
sorry to say. Don't have much. You can hear me. Is that
We
it?
can hear you. Yep. Yep. We can see you and we can
But
hear
I'm
you.
not in the program. I don't know why. I'm not in the program at all. Can you get me in?
You're in the meeting with us, so I don't know. I don't think I can do
Okay.
anything else other than kick you out and have you come back in, but I don't know if that's going to
Can
be
you
good.
do that? I don't know. Okay.
I can try that
All
if
right.
you want.
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay.
I don't have anything here.
All right. We're going to say goodbye to Cyndy for just a moment, and we're going to come back on in a couple of minutes. Okay. I'm going to do that. I think I can do that. All right. I'm going to move you. Okay. All right. Saying goodbye to Cyndy, but we're coming back. Yeah, and I think that that it's been a wonderful talk, and I really liked Lindsay. I wrote the things I wrote down. The archivists and curators are sometimes the great destroyers of history is a fantastic quote, and I think an interesting thing to think about when we're thinking about the choices that we make and how we make those choices. Oh, and Tortoise had to leave for town meeting. Lots of folks have town meeting tonight. So we had a lot of registrants, and I think we've got a lot of folks who are going to be watching the recording afterwards. Which I think is wonderful civic engagement that we've got going on here in Vermont. And we're going to hope to get Cyndy back in a minute. Any questions or comments, either about Lindsay's talk or the topic at all? Feel free again, put them in the comments, in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, I think Cyndy's coming back. See if we can grab her.
Okay, it says that I'm here.
You are here.
Oh, okay, fine. I share screen. I'll try to get to my PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay, it's not really doing it, I'm sorry to say.
Okay.
It's not really sharing the screen.
Okay. So a couple of things we could do, Cyndy. You're welcome to talk in whatever way you'd like to. I don't know if you can quickly email me anything, and I'm happy to share it via my screen as well, if you'd like.
Oh, I can email it to you?
Yep.
Okay.
You can email me the PowerPoint.
Okay, we do that. Okay, Eileen, what's your email?
So it's eileen.corcoran@vermonthistory.org.
Yep, got it.
Okay. So thanks, Beth. Yeah, Cyndy is a co-host, so she should be able to share. So I'm not sure what's going on. So we'll appreciate how Zoom, even after 2 years, never works the way we think it should work, and go from there. Great.
All right, it says that it's coming over to you.
Okay, well, we'll wait just a second. So Cyndy, I don't know if you want to feel free to sort of introduce yourself a little bit and talk about your work a
Can
little
you-
bit, and as I get that.
Yes, can you see me at all? Because I can't see myself at all.
Nope, we can't see you. We can just hear you.
Oh, I see.
So it looks like Cheryl does have a question for Lindsay. What strategies do you
Wait a minute,
recommend?
wait a minute, I've got it now.
There we go. What
Okay.
strategies do you recommend for building trust to get underrepresented communities to share their historical objects? Great question.
Oh, why don't you do that? And you can see if, has my stuff come through to you yet?
Not yet.
Oh,
Yeah, so there were a number of things that I've done at institutions to help build up trust. One of the things was working to open up the institution, so it didn't seem like there were a lot of barriers for coming in. We did a lot of community work, tabling events, going out into the community. I think breaking down expectations that people will just come to you was a huge thing that we started to look at. And then we also started asking questions in the community about how they actually thought of the institution. And more often than not, answers that I would get were that they didn't feel welcomed coming in. Whether it be that the space itself didn't feel welcoming, that they felt they weren't represented whenever they came in. And nobody wants to go to an exhibit and walk around a museum if they don't see themselves or can connect in some way to the exhibit and the interpretation that's being told. So we did a lot of on the ground community work, just working to build the trust, but then also trying to get people to be thinking about the institution as a place of gathering, not just where you go on your field trip when you're in third grade, but it's a place that you can utilize and feel welcomed.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. So hopefully everybody now can see Cyndy's presentation.
yes, Eileen, and do I tell you when to move the slide?
Yep,
Okay.
just let me know.
Okay, good. Since I do teach Vermont history for the Community College of Vermont, I have been looking for a volume for my students to use in the course. In the 1990s, I found articles and put them all together for my students. I am a little bit more of a biographer, so I sought out stories not found in most of the materials that were then available in Vermont history. I called my research sort of hidden history. I contacted historical societies in Vermont and of course the Vermont Historical Society to find stories that might engage my students. I very much wanted my students to know that there were Indigenous people, the Abenakis, and they were the first to live in Vermont. Okay, next slide. I guess I'm supposed to say that to you. Okay. And one of my people that I did talk about was Molly Ockett, of course, because she had spent some time in Vermont, and she was important in terms of people remembering her and remembering her history. And the Bethel, Maine Historical Society helped me with my research. My book was published in 2012, and in 2017, Governor Scott finally declared the end of Columbus Day and replaced it with Indigenous Peoples Day. Next slide. Or do you do that? Oh, there you go. And since historical societies like to tie educational events around holidays, I would suggest more of us create programming on that day or that week. I would also suggest we reach out to the Abenaki for assistance in this effort. I contacted Melody Walker Brook of the Alnu Band, and she helped me find resources for my book and even read over much of my material. And you can imagine reaching out to the different communities and getting the assistance you need. And I must say the Abenaki people were wonderful to me and gave me as much material as I could ever possibly use. It was wonderful. It's also helpful for a historical society or a museum to tie history to present day events and activities. Next slide. Right now, a portrait is being painted of Alexander Twilight. It's to be hung in the State House this year. There were no portraits of people of color, so Katie Rundy of Middlebury was commissioned to paint a portrait of Twilight. He is featured in my book because he was one of the first people of color to graduate from any college in this country and the first person of color to serve in any state legislature in this country. The Orleans County Historical Society, which runs Old Stone House Museum, helped me so much in my research. Next slide. I must say that Nettie Anderson and her brother Will are not well-known people in Vermont history. Yet my inquiry to the Shoreham Historical Society yielded a bounty of biographical information for my book, Vermont Women, Native Americans, and African Americans Out of the Shadows of History. Also, the Middlebury College archives were so helpful. I suggest working with colleges to get in-depth materials. Why did Nettie Anderson interest me so much? She had a family heritage of Native American, African American, and French Canadian. She was the daughter of a slave from the South who traveled to Vermont with a soldier after the Civil War. He married a woman of Indigenous and French heritage. Nettie's family sent her to be educated at Northfield, Massachusetts private school, and she excelled there. The Northfield Seminary for Young Ladies was founded to educate the poor and students of color. She was the class president and wrote the class poem. Then she went on to Middlebury College and was one of the first people of color to attend there in 1895. She also graduated at the top of her class at that college and became the first woman of color in the nation to be awarded the Pi Beta Kappa Key for her high grades. Next slide. She was the class valedictorian and spoke at graduation. And you can see here on this slide, Mary Annette Anderson Shoreham essay with valedictory address, The Crown of Culture. Also, a Shoreham doctorate promised her a cash prize if she graduated ahead of her class. This she did. After graduation, she taught 8th grade in New Orleans for a year and then moved to Washington, D.C. to teach English grammar and history for Howard University. She was an effective club woman in Washington and was well known there and in Shoreham. She married Walter Lewis Smith, the principal of the Dunbar High School, the premier secondary school in the country for Black students. One cannot find her mention in the Howard catalog after her marriage, and one is led to believe that she must have resigned. At that time, particularly in the teaching profession, a woman would cease to participate in public work after she married. I'm assuming she helped her husband in his teaching and maintained homes both in Washington and Shoreham. Unfortunately, she had a short life, dying at the age of 47 in 1922. She did not have children, but her brother's grandchildren remember her fondly and treasure her Pi Beta Kappa Key. I wrote a Vermont commentary on her, as well as featuring her in my book. Her brother, Will, next slide, also interested me, since he was the second man of color to be elected to the Vermont legislature. Remember, I said Alexander Twilight was the first one. Will had attended Mount Hermon Preparatory School, the brother school to Northfield, and ended up managing the student laundry. He was active in the Republican Party, attending Governor Coolidge's inaugural ceremonies in 1919. Remember, Coolidge grew up in Plymouth, Vermont, but went to Amherst College in Massachusetts and had a political career in that state. He also was an advocate for African Americans, so it's not surprising that Will did attend that ceremony. Will returned to Shoreham and began his orchard business, which I pictured here. He must have been pretty successful since he was elected president of the Vermont Horticultural Society in 1935. He was also an advocate for integrating the Masons and served in World War I. A well-known figure in this town of Shoreham, next slide, he served in the Vermont legislature from 1945 to 1949. Yet he was still discriminated against when he was a representative, since when he went to Montpelier, some hotels would not let him stay there. He obviously had thought about discrimination in the Army, since we had to wait for President Harry Truman to integrate the armed forces. Will approached U.S. Senator Warren Austin of Vermont to create an officers training school for African Americans. At one point, he was encouraged to go to an interracial conference in New York, but he replied, to argue learnedly about what the Negro wants, but when all he wants is what any man wants. Will left the legislature to return to the orchard business, but could not adapt to the modern techniques. He became despondent and even tried to take his own life. He did recover, but was blinded. He continued to work in the Shoreham Cooperative and died in 1959, reaching the age of 85. I used newspaper articles as well as information from the Shoreham Historical Society to tell his story. Next slide. For March, Women's History Month, which is coming right up, we must remember well-behaved women seldom make history. So I suggest finding women in your archives. Think of women in your town who were involved in activist movements. This is very much a coin from the abolitionist movement, and also is a coin that was passed around in America. And also look at temperance and suffrage. I did go to Rokeby to obtain materials about the Robinsons, but Lindsay can talk about that. I also obtained insights from the Norwich Historical Society, since they had records of temperance meetings, and their town green has a water fountain. Next slide. To remind people of temperance. Cold drinking water would deter people from drinking alcoholic beverages. The bronze plaque states, "Water is life." They also provided minutes from the Norwich Female Abolition Society, which formed in 1843, with the goal, quote, to use all means sanctioned by law, humanity, and religion for the entire and unconditional abolition of slavery in this country, for the elevation of the character and condition of people of color, and their admission to equal rights and privileges with whites. These Norwich women packed up boxes of clothing for slaves to use once they made it to Canada. They also formed a cent society, that's CENT. This was a way to raise funds for their projects. 1 cent per week was saved by each member. These women were political actors, writing constitutions, voting for their own officers, organizing meetings, fundraising, petitioning. Next slide. I featured Clarina Howard Nichols and Annette. I'm going to show you slides of them next, but I also, here's a good one of typical gatherings like the Norwich women. And here's the New Fame women. And I do refer all of you, if you haven't gotten to the Women's History Project at the Vermont Historical Society. Next slide, I think that might be, the next slide's probably Clarina Howard Nichols though. Go ahead, Eileen. No, it's going to be a square deal, votes for women. Well, you can go back to square deal, that's okay. The suffrage movement was one of the smallest movements in the nation, but had wonderful, clever ideas. A woman in Grafton thought of this one, a square deal, votes for women, votes for Vermont women. And it was very important that she worked on this. And then there are a couple more slides on. The next one is Clarina Howard Nichols, who did speak, first one to speak to the Vermont legislature. And she wanted women to be able to vote in school meetings. And you can read through their wonderful historic marker. Clarina Howard Nichols, born in West Townsend in 1810. She was an early advocate for women's rights. Yes, she went around the country speaking on women's rights. After her divorce, well, she divorced because her husband really could not help support the family. As an editor of the Windham County Democrat, she strongly advocated women's property rights, child custody, temperance, and suffrage. In 1852, she was the first woman to address the Vermont legislature, and that was for voting in schools. and she lectured throughout New England and the Midwest. She was an abolitionist who seized opportunity and eventually went to Kansas, where her views on slavery and women's rights were widely accepted. And I think she wrote their constitution too. During the Civil War, she was director of the Home for Orphan Black Children in Washington, D.C., and even gets to California. So she's quite someone to remember, and important for us during this Women's History Month, especially, to feature in our historical societies women who've made a difference. Next slide, I think is going to be Clarina again. And as many of you know, Marilyn Blackwell, who's one of our wonderful Vermont historians, has worked with another writer and written a biography of Clarina Howard Nichols. Next slide. This I wanted you to see, the Vermont Women's History Project. It's described here. Many of us, including myself, gathered this material, and I encourage all of you in your historical societies to think about contributing to this database. Nice to see that in summer of 2020, it was revised and updated as part of the celebration for women's suffrage. So there is a digital resource. If you want to work on women's history in Vermont, you can go there and find information. It features not only women in these early movements, but also women in the legislature over the years. And Governor Cunin made a point of hiring women to help her. And she wanted to open the door for women. And you can see many biographies of people she worked with. Okay, the next one is Annette Parmalee, who was another person who fought very hard for suffrage. And she obtained the vote in municipal elections for tax-paying women. So you can see these are small victories, but they're very important victories. And Annette was called the suffrage hornet because she was constantly speaking and trying to bring suffrage up as an important issue in Vermont. She even wanted the governor to have Vermont be the 36th state to pass the constitutional amendment to give women the vote. And of course, he refused and did not call a special gathering of the legislature to do this. But she was quite someone in history too. But finding information on women can be difficult. Historians over the years have collected diaries and letters of males in their communities. Graves often didn't even have maiden names of the women buried there. So research can be daunting, yet as also can be rewarding. Next slide. With letters from women to soldiers during the Civil War that have been collected by the Historical Societies in Vermont. We have so much from the Civil War, so many letters. When I teach Vermont history, I have my students read letters, both from soldiers and from the home front. And it brings this type of history home to the students every year, every semester that I teach. They say this is one of the most meaningful things they can do. And we have historical societies and Vermont Historical Society and UVM have wonderful collections that you can look at. Also, think about projects that women were involved in. Women were teachers. Next slide. They were teachers in one-room schoolhouses. So research the history of education in your town. Women were often nurses, so medical records might be a good place to go. Women also sometimes ran businesses. Next slide. And this is you can have fun with this subject too. It doesn't have to be so serious, because the next slide is the wonderful Philomene Daniels of Vergennes. And she had her own business ferrying people around Lake Champlain. So she was the first female boat captain. It's fun to do first too. I always feel that. I put a lot of firsts in my book. And the next slide has a picture of her, which is kind of fun. Yeah, there she is. See, with her beautiful hat, she's quite the one. Now, how to sponsor programs with these stories? Well, work with your local libraries. Just last week, I run the Hanover, New Hampshire Historical Society, and we worked with our local library on a program of Indigenous history. So it's great working with the library. Partnering with them will bring more people to your events, either in person or on Zoom. The Vermont Humanities Council will help with funding and suggestions of speakers. Jeannie Brink is listed as a speaker on Abenakis history, and Jane Beck tells of Daisy Turner, the African-American woman with quite a story in Grafton. And think about historic markers. Next slide. I've shown you one on Clarina Howard Nichols, and the next slide has one on Jeffrey Brace. In my book, I have pictures of this one. A professor who's here in the picture did the research on his history, Jeffrey Brace's history, and then contacted descendants for a special unveiling of the marker. It is always good to find people interested in this history. Choose a special day, get the press to cover it, and go for it. We all need positive publicity about our historical society and museums. And you can read about Jeffrey Brace here, who was born in West Africa with the name of Boyero Burish. At 16, he was captured, shipped to Barbados, sold to the ship's captain, eventually arrived in New England. Some years later, still enslaved, he entered, it says, enlisted in the Continental Army, and he won his freedom fighting in the Revolution. At the war's end, in 1784, he settled in Fulton. In newly formed Vermont, the first state to prohibit slavery. He met an ex-slave, married, and they raised their family here. In 1810, he published his life story, one of the most unique and important anti-slavery memoirs written in America. And what I did with my book, I often quote from these people in their biographies. I often quote their words, and it's kind of fun to do that too. Okay, many historical societies want to create books just to help educate their people about what happened. The Norwich Historical Society began their book with Native American settlements. I guess next slide. On that, Eileen. Yeah. So they were beginning with Indigenous history on their historical timeline. They also sponsored a talk just recently by Abenakis historians in January. So they are aware of broadening the history, just what we talked about, just what Lindsay talked about, beyond the white male stories documented in most historical records. So next slide. I came up with this checklist for us, and I include myself in it too. Have we included Indigenous stories when we do our presentations? Have we included people of color? Have we gender balanced stories? Have we even sought out people of diverse backgrounds for our boards? And then maybe you, the listeners out there, can come up with some more questions. How do we preserve and promote history? How do we be inclusive? What would be your suggestions? So thank you. Oh, last slide is just a picture of my book. You can see that if you want. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Cyndy. I'm not sure if everybody else had a little interference, but we had a little bit of interference with your last slide with your audio. So I'm going to stop share. And if anybody has any questions for Cyndy or missed out a little bit on that last bit, feel free to let me know or let Cyndy know, and I'm sure we can get back to that a little bit as well. So feel free again, any questions, comments, thoughts in the chat, or raise your hand, and we're happy to take those. No questions. Okay. Everybody's ready to go. So, okay. No questions. Anything else wrapping up, Lindsay or Cyndy? Oh,
well, I would wonder, can you hear me now better?
Yep.
Is there anyone out there who has a successful story they want to share with us of how they found some unusual history, and that we could learn from them? I'm sure there are many people out there who've got something that they've done, but maybe we're catching them a little bit. Maybe they want to add that later.
Good question. Okay. And there was a question for Lindsay. So if anybody wants to think about it, or again, put the info in the chat, feel free. Was Harriet still alive to see the cemetery designated as a historical site?
Yes, she was. She sadly just passed away a few months ago. So she was there when it became a county historic register site. And she was also around whenever the National Register accepted the nomination for the site as well.
Wonderful. Nice. Great. Okay. Wonderful. So I'm going to say big thank you to Lindsay and Cyndy for some wonderful things for us all to think about and to consider. And I think that this is a topic hopefully we'll keep talking about. And I think that will be great work for all of us to do and think about for our own organizations and our own communities. So thanks again, everyone. You'll hear from me again with information on the recording and link that you can share out. Feel free with anyone else who you think might be interested in the talk. Thanks again, everyone, and hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.